When World War II broke out in 1939, not only soldiers but also medical personnel were quickly drawn into the brutal vortex of conflict. Among those in white coats serving the German army was a special group, the nurses of the German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, DRK Schwestern. They were both women on a mission to care for the wounded and products of a training system heavily infused with Nazi ideology. Through long campaigns in Poland, France, the Balkans, and then North Africa, these nurses lived and worked under conditions of extreme medical scarcity, witnessing firsthand the gradual collapse of the German military medical system as the war dragged on. Yet it was precisely this deprivation that made their psychological shock even greater when they fell into American hands, where a medical system they had been taught to view as backward revealed itself to be far beyond anything they could have imagined. From the very start of the war, Germany's military medical services lacked the resources to meet growing demands. Medical supplies were restricted by economic blockades, while many advanced medical innovations were stifled by anti-Jewish policies and state interference. By 1941-1942, shortages had become severe. Traditional antibacterial drugs such as sulfonamides were in critically short supply, while penicillin, the miracle drug then being mass-produced in the United States, remained completely out of reach for German medicine. During the North African campaign under General Erwin Rommel, DRK nurses had to make do with meager supplies, bandages washed and reused until threadbare, anesthetics diluted to stretch them further, and blood transfusions carried out directly from donor to patient, a risky and ineffective method. Surgeries were performed in the sweltering desert heat, often with poor lighting and inadequate instruments, leading many soldiers to die from infection rather than their initial wounds. Within this context, German nurses were taught and trained to believe they were still serving an advanced medical tradition, merely hindered by temporary wartime difficulties. Nazi propaganda emphasized that America was nothing more than an industrial giant lacking in culture and science, that American medical skills were crude and could never compare to Europe's long-standing medical heritage. This belief was reinforced by DRK's training programs, which strongly integrated politics and ideology. Medicine was not only about healing, but also about serving racial strength. Concepts such as Nazi eugenics, racial purification, and elimination of the weak were taught alongside nursing techniques, convincing many nurses that healthcare itself was a tool of war and ideology. The turning point came in 1943, when the North African campaign ended in disastrous defeat for the Axis. On May 13th of that year, more than 250,000 German and Italian troops were forced to surrender to the Allies in Tunisia. Among them were thousands of medical personnel, including doctors, orderlies, and DRK nurses. For many, this was their first time falling into American hands, and their first direct encounter with an entirely different medical system. Even at the initial prisoner processing points, they were astonished. Every captured nurse and doctor underwent thorough health examinations, using equipment they had not seen in years within the German army. Minor infections were treated immediately. Some were even given eyeglasses or dental care, services considered luxuries even back home, aboard Liberty ships, the mass-produced American transport vessels. The German nurses became even more convinced that the propaganda they had believed was false. The onboard medical facilities were fully equipped, operating rooms with stable electric lighting, functioning X-ray machines, refrigerators stocked with medicines and blood supplies. Most striking of all was the availability of stored plasma, ready for use on multiple patients without compatibility concerns, thanks to systematic testing and storage methods. For nurses accustomed to risky direct blood transfusions, this was nothing short of a revolution. They saw American doctors using antibiotics freely, bandages discarded after a single use, and even food wasted, experiences that left them both stunned and doubtful. Upon arrival in the United States, the contrast in medical culture only deepened. In prisoner-of-war camps such as Opelika, Alabama, Camp Forest, Tennessee, and Glennon General Hospital, Oklahoma, German nurses encountered a dual system. They continued to care for German prisoners and patients under American supervision, while at the same time being exposed to new techniques. For the first time, many saw electrocardiographs, ECG, electric suction devices, adjustable hospital beds, or autoclaves capable of sterilizing in minutes rather than hours. The difference was not only material but also philosophical. Whereas in Germany, nurses were considered mere subordinates bound to absolute obedience, in the U.S. they were encouraged to observe, voice opinions, and take direct responsibility for patient outcomes. This fundamentally altered how they perceived their own profession. Another deeply shocking factor was the presence of African American nurses and doctors. Under the racial segregation system in the U.S., they were often assigned to care for prisoners rather than white soldiers. Yet it was precisely this arrangement that allowed many German nurses to witness firsthand that those whom Nazi propaganda had labeled inferior were in fact highly skilled, professionally trained, and conducted themselves with exemplary care toward prisoners. This contradiction forced them to confront the falsehoods of the racist education they had received. Between 1943 and 1944, more and more German medical personnel, including DRK nurses, had similar experiences, exposure to the abundance and advanced nature of American healthcare. For them, this was not only a story of medicine and equipment, but also of a medical philosophy grounded in empirical science and humanitarian principles, standing in stark opposition to the politicized version of medicine they had been trained under. The more they were exposed, the more they realized that America's true strength did not lie in propaganda, but in industrial production capacity, investment in science, and the philosophy that even an enemy patient deserved treatment as a human being. For many German nurses, these first encounters in American hands acted as a mirror, revealing the harsh truth that the medical system they had served was falling far behind. While Germany scraped for every drop of medicine and scrap of bandage, America produced medical supplies on an industrial scale. While Germany trained nurses to serve ideology, America trained nurses to serve patients. This stark contrast laid the foundation for the profound intellectual transformation they would undergo during their years as prisoners of war, a process that would shape not only their personal lives but also contribute to the reshaping of German healthcare after the war. After the initial days of confusion upon being taken prisoner, many German nurses began to realize a reality completely different from the fear instilled in them during the war. For years, they had been told that if they ever fell into Allied hands, especially those of the Americans or Soviets, they would face humiliation, violence, or even death. Yet, in American prisoner of war camps in France, Italy, or even on U.S. soil, they witnessed something entirely different: order, discipline, and above all, a relatively humane prisoner healthcare system. For nurses long accustomed to shortages in the German army, this was a profound cultural shock, not born of brutality, but of abundance and modernity. The first striking difference was medicine. At the front, they had struggled with a chronic shortage of antibiotics, often relying only on outdated antiseptics like iodine or silver nitrate. In American camps, however, penicillin had become almost commonplace. Mass-produced in the U.S. since 1943 through government cooperation with major pharmaceutical firms, penicillin quickly earned its reputation as a miracle drug for treating wound infections, pneumonia, and post-surgical complications, diseases that had claimed countless German lives. For the first time, German nurses saw how a small vial of medicine could save patients they once thought doomed. The helplessness that had haunted them on the battlefield gave way to astonishment, and at times envy. Equally astonishing was America's blood transfusion system. While Germany still relied heavily on direct donor-to-patient transfusions, dangerous and dependent on finding a donor on the spot, the U.S. had successfully developed large-scale storage and transport of blood plasma. In the camps, nurses saw stockpiles of freeze-dried plasma ready to be reconstituted and used at a moment's notice. This meant American soldiers had far higher chances of survival, even far from frontline hospitals. Some German nurses recorded in their diaries, "America has turned blood into a strategic weapon, and we never managed to catch up." The modernity of American facilities was equally undeniable. In camp infirmaries, they encountered mobile X-ray machines, stainless steel operating tables, and high-pressure steam sterilizers, tools far superior to anything they had been issued in the German army. Even small details astonished them. Disposable rubber gloves, individually packed sterile syringes. In German field hospitals, gloves were washed and reused, and syringes often served dozens of patients with enormous risk of cross-infection. The contrast was not merely technical, it symbolized the vast gap in industrial capacity and organizational power between the two nations. Yet the POW camp experience was not confined to medicine alone. As women trained under the Nazi system, where their role was bound to politics and ideology, they suddenly collided with a very different social reality. One of the greatest shocks came from working alongside African American doctors and nurses. To them, this was almost unthinkable. Since childhood, they had been taught that colored races were inferior, lacking intellectual ability. Yet in camp hospitals, they saw black doctors performing surgeries, black nurses supervising patient care, even instructing them in daily routines. Faced with such living evidence, many German nurses felt their long-held beliefs shaken to the core. Daily life in the camps also left lasting impressions. Though prisoners, they received diets far more nutritious than civilians back home in Germany, where food shortages had become routine. Camp meals, sometimes including canned meat, powdered milk, fresh vegetables, made them ache for their families enduring hunger under Allied bombing. Even personal medical services, dental care, eyeglasses, treatment for skin conditions were provided free of charge to prisoners, luxuries they had rarely experienced in Germany. Such care, whether intentional or not, forced them to compare how Americans treated their enemies with how Nazi Germany treated its own citizens. Spiritually, German nurses began a process of disenchantment. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a decadent society obsessed with materialism and lacking discipline. Yet in the camps, they saw the opposite: smooth coordination between doctors, nurses, guards, and even prisoners. They saw that American healthcare was built on science, procedure, and respect for human beings, things the Third Reich, despite its military might, could not guarantee in medicine. Of course, not everything was easy. Some nurses felt humiliated working under enemy supervision or struggled with guilt, receiving good care while their families suffered at home. Others faced criticism from fellow prisoners, accused of being too friendly with Americans. Yet, despite such conflicts, the experience left a deep imprint, one they carried for the rest of their lives, even after returning to Germany. When the war ended and repatriation began, many nurses came home with mixed emotions. They rejoiced at freedom, yet carried with them knowledge and experiences they could not easily share in a defeated, embittered Germany. Still, some quietly applied what they had learned: the use of antibiotics, sterile procedures, hospital organization modeled on American systems. In this way, they became invisible bridges, contributing to the modernization of German medicine in the post-war era. Most important of all was the change in worldview. Many had seen with their own eyes equal care given to German prisoners and American soldiers, had watched black doctors holding the scalpel, had themselves been saved by medicines Germany could never produce. These experiences revealed to them that medicine, at its core, could not be bound by borders or race. That realization became a spiritual legacy transcending the war itself, one that helped many of them rediscover meaning in their profession after 1945. When the whistles of war finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was immersed in a landscape of devastation unlike anything seen before. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, its army disbanded, cities reduced to ashes, and millions left starving and displaced. For the nurses who had been held as prisoners of war in American camps, the journey home was not merely a physical return, but also a profound psychological shock, forcing them once again to confront a harsh reality. The repatriation process itself was grueling. Although the United States and Britain abided by the Geneva Convention, the return of POWs was carried out gradually, in waves, prioritizing the severely wounded or those with special circumstances. Female nurses were often among the first to be sent home, since they were not considered a military threat. Yet their journey was anything but smooth. Many spent months in temporary holding camps, traveled by train through ruined landscapes, and witnessed civilians packed into stations, hungry and sick. Compared to the relative stability in American camps, where they had received food, medical care, and basic shelter, Germany struck them with brutal immediacy, a homeland in ruins, families scattered, and a society falling apart. The deepest trauma lay in the contrast between two worlds. In American camps, many nurses had experienced modern medicine, structured hospital systems, and a humanitarian approach to care. Back in Germany, they faced crushing shortages, collapsed hospitals, looted equipment, and virtually no antibiotics. They were forced to revert to pre-war methods, binding wounds with cloth, disinfecting with alcohol, and relying on a patient's natural resistance. For those who had seen a single penicillin injection save a life within days, this regression was bitter and painful. Social pressures compounded their struggles. Post-war Germans often distrusted anyone who had any connection, however indirect, with the enemy. Some nurses, because they had been in American custody, were even viewed as privileged. They were questioned about what food they had eaten, whether they had been forced to work for the Americans, and sometimes envied for appearing healthier than women who had endured the bombings at home. In some cases, local authorities refused to reinstate them in hospitals, claiming positions should be reserved for those who had suffered inside the country. Yet despite these obstacles, the knowledge and experience they carried home proved invaluable to rebuilding German healthcare. Nurses who had seen how Americans organized hospitals into clearly defined hierarchies applied those methods in shattered local clinics, separating wards, enforcing sterilization routines, and managing supplies more systematically. Some, remembering the use of antibiotics, became pioneers when penicillin began arriving in Germany in the late 1940s through the Marshall Plan. They taught colleagues how to administer doses, calculate treatments, and guard against resistance, skills unfamiliar even to many German doctors at the time. Another, less visible but equally vital change lay in their sense of professional identity. Under the Nazi regime, nursing was tightly bound to serving the war machine and political ideology. Nurses were deployed not only to heal the wounded, but also to uphold fighting spirit, sometimes even being drawn into propaganda programs. Their time in American camps revealed a different principle. Nursing existed first and foremost for the patient, regardless of nationality or skin color. Many who had cared for fellow POWs came to realize that every wounded person is the same when lying in a hospital bed. Bringing this outlook back to Germany gradually influenced post-war training and practice in nursing. Perhaps the most profound shift came from their encounters with black doctors and nurses in American camps. Returning home, they could no longer accept racial prejudice as they once had. Some later recalled speaking out against racist remarks during conversations at home, having personally witnessed African American physicians saving lives with remarkable skill. While they could not erase the Nazi legacy overnight, these experiences planted seeds for a more open, egalitarian outlook among a new generation of German healthcare workers. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, as West Germany recovered with American aid, new hospitals were built following modern models. Former POW nurses became central to training younger staff. They shared stories about the miracle of penicillin, the organization of operating rooms, and the necessity of hygiene. Some became instructors in nursing schools, using their camp experiences as living testimony that medicine must be tied to industrial progress and international cooperation. In East Germany, under Soviet control, their stories unfolded differently. Nurses returning from American captivity were often viewed with suspicion or placed under surveillance. Their chances to apply new knowledge were limited, as the Soviet-style system dismissed Western influence as bourgeois. Yet privately, many still implemented what they had learned, especially in sanitation and basic care, quietly raising standards despite the lack of recognition. On a personal level, these women lived with inner conflict. They were proud to have brought back valuable lessons and to have contributed to modernizing German healthcare. Yet they also carried guilt, aware that they had enjoyed relative privileges in American camps while compatriots at home endured hunger and bombs. Some concealed their experiences for decades, only sharing them with family after German reunification in 1990. In a broader sense, their story illustrates a paradox of war. Even in captivity, exposure to knowledge and humanity can spark long-lasting transformation. These German nurses, once small cogs in the machinery of conflict, became bridges between two medical worlds. They returned not only with scientific understanding, but with a new vision of their vocation. Medicine exists to save lives, not to serve ideology. By the 1960s, as West Germany entered its economic miracle, many practices they had first encountered in American camps had become national standards, from widespread antibiotic use to rigorous sterilization protocols to professionalized nursing education. In this way, the seemingly isolated experiences of a few hundred POW nurses made a small but crucial contribution to Germany's integration into modern global medicine. Ultimately, what endured in their memory was not only the pain of war, but also a profound awakening that true progress arises not from violence or propaganda, but from humanity and science. And that awareness stayed with them for life, a reminder that even in the darkest shadows of war, sparks of compassion and knowledge can emerge strong enough to shape an entire generation.